God. Now, we've been going through this study of Romans. We know this is Paul writing here to these Roman Christians. The Roman Christians are getting persecuted a lot during this time. The power that is Rome is in charge. They don't like the Christians. The Jews that are there as well, they don't like the Christians. The Jews think that their way is right. They think that they are righteous and holy. They think that they have nothing wrong with them. They think that because of the laws that they have been keeping now for so many thousands of years, allowed them to be blameless before God. But Paul is here and has been here to tell them that that is not necessarily the case. As a matter of fact, he tells them that's not the case at all. That the law was no longer something that they should be following. That they are now under grace because of the fact that Christ came and died for their sins. And of course we know that the Jewish people, the Pharisees, the scribes and Pharisees very much didn't like Jesus. Were always trying to make him slip up when he was here, and he was always teaching them lessons and trying to explain to them, that he was the Messiah, that he was the Son of God, that he was the come to save them from their sins because of his sacrifice, and they didn't want anything to do with it. Paul was, again, one of these people for quite some time, right? We know that Paul was a high-ranking Jew that was persecuting Christians because he thought he was right. And we have seen now over the last couple of weeks that because of the 180-degree turn that Paul had at Damascus, which is kind of the whole premise of what this study is about, because of that 180-degree turn that he essentially saw the light, right? He had that come to Jesus moment. And it changed him completely. And now he has a burning desire to let everybody know around him the importance of having a relationship with Christ. Okay? He's had this desire now for quite some time to go to Rome. God has always kind of worked differently in his life and put him in different places. But he's writing this letter to the Roman Christians and to the Jews that are there as well, explaining to them essentially what it means to have a relationship with Christ. And first couple of chapters here, he's talked about sin and he's talked about the importance of having this relationship. And I told you last week when we finished up is that Paul is going to go into the few verses here to where he's just rattling some stuff off. And what he's doing is he's essentially telling these Jewish people and people he's writing to, he's giving them a court case in which he's explaining to them how they're wrong and how essentially he's right. And how that the things that they have been following are wrong. And while they have spent a lot of time following these laws and have been very dedicated to them, and they think that because they have followed some of these laws they are righteous, he's explaining to them why they're not. And that's what we've got here. There's the whole from verse 17 of chapter 2 all the way to verse 8 of chapter 3. Paul is explaining this Jewish guilt before God. Now, he goes on here towards the end of this to make this into universal guilt, right? It's not just the Jews that are guilty of sin. It's everybody that is guilty of sin. And when we get to the last part of this, we're going to be able to take verses 8 through 20 of chapter 3, and is what, if you were taking, a Bible course on Romans or taking a Bible study, they call that the depravity of man. And we're going to be able to take verses 8 through 20, which is what I really want to get to today and talk about the depravity of man a little bit. But we got to get through this Jewish guilt first, right? This is a big deal. A lot of Jews around this time, a lot of them have been following this law for a really long time, and they've been persecuting these Christians, and there's a lot of kind of stuff going on historically in Rome. So Paul has to address this, right? Because Paul doesn't just want some people to be saved, right? Because Paul was a Jew that had been saved. So he understands kind of the mindset of what these Jewish people are like, and he understands how they're wrong, and he wants them to kind of see the light as well. So we get, first of all, here the Jewish guilt before God. Go ahead and hit the next one for me, please. And he starts off, he gives them kind of two things here, that kind of the background of this Jewish idea. The first one is that possessing the law did not necessarily bring righteousness unto them. Let's look at verse 17 here, and let's go to verse 20 first. And we'll see a little bit of him talking about this, them having the law, therefore thinking of the righteous. Romans chapter 2, verse 17 down to verse 20. And verse 17 starts off by saying this, "Behold, thou art called a Jew, and retest in the law, and makest thy boast of God, and knowest his will, and approvest the things that are more excellent, being instructed out of the law, and art confident that thou thyself art a guide of the blind, a light of themselves which are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of babes, which hath the form of knowledge and of the truth in the law. So go ahead and hit the next one for me, Landon. We see that they possessed the law, therefore they thought they were righteous. And Paul is going to give them the reasons why this is not the case. And he starts off here by talking about this Jewish confidence that we saw in these 3 verses. Now, even though the Jews here, they were under the rule of the Roman Empire during this time, right? The Roman Empire was in charge of everything. The Jews are under the dominion of the Roman Empire. The Jews still considered them to be very elite. They considered themselves to be elite of the elite of the world's people. And Paul's reviewing some of these reasons here for why they have this feeling of superiority. And most notably is because the Jews thought that because they had the law that God had given them, they had a divine rule that wouldn't mislead them and that made them a little more superior to everybody else. As a matter of fact, they took that law, right, and they trusted it to save them. They trusted that the law was saving them. But at this point, so what should the Jews, by this point, what should they have learned about themselves by trying to keep the law? Now, listen, thousands of years these Jews have been doing this. What should they have learned by now about trying to keep the law? That they couldn't do it, right? They could maybe keep some parts of it. And maybe, sometimes but they would never be able to keep the entire law. All right? And that's kind of what, the Jews should have kind of figured out during this time. But it was actually the complete opposite. The Jews actually went so far as to boast, to talk about their relationship with God. They believed they were pleasing Him by keeping some of the law, and their efforts of keeping the law was pleasing God. And they were congratulating themselves and congratulating the other Jews on their standing with God. Even though they weren't keeping the whole law, the fact they were trying to, they thought that put them in good standing with God. So what can we conclude about a person, maybe not just the Jew here in this instance, but a person who boasts about himself when talking about his relationship with God? What can you conclude about a person who boasts about himself when talking about his relationship with God? Always talking about how great his relationship is, how holy he or she is. What would you conclude about one of those type of people?
Not very honest with themselves.
Not very honest with themselves. That's very good. What else? Maybe he thinks that God's favor is attainable by something that he can do. Right? If he's always boasting about the stuff that he's doing as a Christian, he's kind of talking about God has favor with him or her because he's being so godly or being so Christianly. I think what we could say about somebody like that is that he or she doesn't understand the need for God's grace in salvation. Now, the Jews' awareness of God's will, right? In verse 18 of chapter 2, the awareness of God's will was not a working knowledge that they gained through experience, right? Verse 18, and Paul says, you knowest His will, right? And approvest the things that are more excellent, being instructed of the law. They knew the will here, but it wasn't a working knowledge of what they had gained through experiences. Paul was referring to knowing what God commanded, what He forbids, what He approves, what He rewards, and their knowledge came from this written revelation that they had, the law that they had. And receiving God's revelation in the law was an honor for the Jews. They considered it an honor, but that certainly didn't merit the attention from God. Right? God chose them to be His people. The Jews are His chosen people, and He chose them by His grace. And the Jews discerned moral values from the law that God had given them. But verse 18 that Paul says here, he's using the same words that he uses in other parts of the Bible, especially in Philippians. Over in Philippians 1, he says, that ye may approve the things that are excellent. He's using the same words, referring here to the sense of right and the sense of wrong, and the ability to determine the sense of right and the sense of wrong. And all those things came from having the law. So the Jews thought that because they had this law, they possessed the law that God had given them, they had confidence in their righteousness. He goes on to verse 19 and 20 and talks some more about this possessing of the law and the confidence that they have because of it. Verse 19 he says, and thou art confident that thou thyself art a guide of the blind, a light of them which are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of babes, which thou hast the form of knowledge and of truth in the law. So Paul goes on to say, because you have the law and you think that you are teaching the law to people who don't know the law, that you have a higher authority because of the law. And they think that they have the righteousness, the saving grace of God because they have the law. They're directing and instructing other people. Now, having the law, having been able to read the law and have it in their hands, that did enable the Jews to give some spiritual insight to other people. Right? And to give some spiritual light to those who were in spiritual darkness. And God's intention was for choosing them as the nation that for choosing them as His chosen people, was that they were going to be the light to the Gentiles. But by the time the New Testament rolled around, by the time we get to this period, the Jewish religious leaders were much more concerned with recruiting followers to following them than they were spreading spiritual light to the people who were in spiritual darkness. They were more concerned with getting people to follow them than they were explaining what the word of the Lord actually was to the people who didn't know. The scribes and the Pharisees were spreading a work-based salvation, and they were spreading it far and wide. They were creating very zealous followers who were very dedicated to this, and Jesus actually had no kind words for what these people were doing at all. Let's go to Matthew real quick in chapter 23. Matthew 23, let's look at verse 15. And we'll see what the scribes and Pharisees here were accomplishing by their efforts. Verse 15, Jesus says, woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees. Then he actually goes on to say what? Hypocrites, right? Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. For ye compass sea and land to make one proselyte. And when he is made, ye make him twofold more the child of hell than yourselves. So this is Jesus speaking directly to the scribes and the Pharisees here. These Jewish leaders that we've been talking about, who think they're righteous, who think they have the way, who think that because they have the law and they're God's chosen people, they have everything figured out in their life. Right? They're good. This is what Christ says to them. Verse 15, let's read it again. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you compass sea and land, you go everywhere you can to make one proselyte or one follower of you. Right? And when he is made, you make him twofold more the child of hell than yourselves. They made their proselytes sons of hell who took zealousness for spreading their false doctrine to even higher levels. Let's go to verse 14 of chapter 15. So go to Matthew 15 for me, please, and look at verse 14. We see some more Jesus talking about the ability here of these Jewish religious leaders and the spiritually blind. Chapter 15, verse 14 says this, let them alone, that they be blind leaders of the blind, and if the blind lead the blind, both shall fall into the ditch. Jesus here is calling the Jewish spiritual leaders, these scribes and Pharisees that we're talking about here in Romans, he's calling these spiritual leaders blind guides who are falling into a ditch along with the spiritually blind people that are leading into the ditch. Any confidence a Jew had because God had given him the law was misplaced. Possessing the law was not the same as possessing salvation. Now, we've said this before. We can take these self-righteous Jews and we can line them up with people that we know today. As a matter of fact, we may be able to take these self-righteous Jews and line them up with ourselves sometimes. Because we see that how they were living their lives and thinking that if they just did enough stuff, enough good stuff, kept enough of the law, did enough of the right stuff, that they would eventually get to heaven. And how many people do we know today who thinks that as long as I'm a good person, I go to church sometimes, I throw a little money in the offering plate I try to make sure that my coworkers are treated the right way, try to raise my kids the best I can raise them. As long as I'm a pretty good person, then maybe I'll get into heaven. Then you have Paul, who says, guys, there's only one way. And that you think you're righteous, you have this confidence, but this confidence is really a big cloud of smoke. Because Christ came, He said He was here, He said He was going to do what He did. He then did what He said He was going to do so that you could have a relationship with Him, so that you could get rid of the sin, so that you could get out of the punishment of sin and not have to worry about your works. Because Christ already took care of it. And this confidence that these Jewish people had, Paul's telling them, is the same confidence that maybe we had at one time, or we have now as unsaved people, thinking that we can just do enough to get by. Go to the next one for me, please. We see the Jewish confidence in verses 21 and 22. We also see the Jewish contemplation. Now, Paul is continuing to address the Jews here by asking them some piercing questions. Right? He's kind of set up his opening case here, and now he's going to ask them some piercing questions to indict the Jews for all the hypocrisy that they're kind of living in. Let's look at verse 21 and 22 back of Romans chapter 2 again. 21 says this, Thou therefore, which teachest another, teachest thou not thyself? Thou that preachest a man should not steal, then doest thou steal. Verse 22, Thou that sayest the man should not commit adultery, dost thou then commit adultery? Thou that abhorrest idols, dost thou commit sacrilege? So he's asking them some questions here. He's essentially telling them that they are not practicing what they are preaching. That these Jewish righteous people are not practicing what they're preaching. Now, the indictment here of hypocrisy was not meant for all Jews, right? Then or now are guilty of these sins that Paul named. But the prevailing Jewish leadership at the time, all right, the leaders and the followers of Paul's days were undeniably guilty of these things that he just asked them about. The first question in verse 21 implies here that the Jews did not practice the precepts of their own law. Right? He says, Thou therefore which teachest another, teachest not thyself. You're not practicing what you preach. Now that probably doesn't surprise anybody. No one can keep the entirety of the law. But the Jewish religious leaders who broke their own law were breaking it without any remorse that they were breaking the law. Right? They didn't feel any remorse or shame because of the guilt that they should have for breaking the law. It wasn't as if they tried to keep the whole law and failed at a few points. They were brazenly disobeying the law. Later on here in the passage that we're going to see, Paul talks about the Jews being very concerned about their reputation for following the law. They wanted the people to believe they were really good at following the law instead of actually following. As a matter of fact, he then makes some direct references to that as we get kind of later on in this. So what must be true, of a person who is willing to act like they are purposely keeping the law, but then brazenly not keeping it? What must be true of that person? And then the person obviously is full of self-righteousness, full of greed, full of self-centeredness, and a cold heart. Verse. Pardon?
They don't understand the grace of God.
Exactly, right. That's the whole point that Paul is always is bringing to. Right? He's trying to get these people to understand that they don't understand what the grace of God is and what it can do for them in their lives. Some of the Jews here, verse 22, are guilty of adultery. Right? He brings it, kind of gives them some specific sins here in verse 22. It's, thou sayest the man should not commit adultery, and then doest thou commit adultery. Now the sin, this was actually a pretty common sin among Jewish leaders. Okay, now this was one that they would commit privately. Right, there was quite a bit of adulterous relationships going on, but they would do this privately because they didn't want that to get out into the open. Right, because that would do what to their reputation? That would destroy their reputation as a religious leader. But Paul's calling. Now, Paul's been in the middle of this, right? He has seen some of this stuff going on. So he's able to call them out, saying, you're telling these people not to commit adultery, but then you're going and doing the same thing. Are you not? The third question here is, and it talks about it in verse 22 as well, about abortioning idols and committing sacrilege. This means here that the Jews were literally robbing the temples. Now, while Jews shunned the idols, it appears here that they were not above selling idols, selling the stuff that went along with the idols, or other heathen temple things for their own financial gain. And it may be that they occasionally kind of stole some of those things and kept some of those things for themselves. Now, along the same lines, the Jews were guilty of profaning their own temples with their usury, right? We know over in Matthew 21, you don't have to turn over there, but we know that Jesus came into the temple, and what was going on in the temple? They were just selling stuff, right? They were just selling stuff. And how did Jesus react to that? It's like one of the times we saw him really get upset, right? And he flips the tables. You kind of see the imagery, him flipping the tables over and kicking the Jews, kicking them out of the temple because of what they were doing. So Paul's calling them on that as well. And you know you're not supposed to be doing this, but you're doing it anyways. You're brazenly doing it, but you still consider yourself righteous because you're keeping the law in some way. Now, Paul here in these verses gives the Jews a lot to think about, a lot to contemplate. But in case they tried to excuse themselves from any wrongdoing here, he went on to outright condemn them for their practices. Go ahead and go to the next one for me, please. And we see in verses 23 and 24 the condemnation, the Jewish condemnation that Paul gives them. Let's look at these two verses, please, 23 and 24. Thou that makest thy boast of the law, through breaking the laws dishonorest thou God. For the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles through you, as it is written. The Jews here had a supreme boast that they loved to just kind of hang over everybody else's head. The possession of the law. The possession of the law that God had given him. But they had not obeyed the law. And in not obeying the law, they had dishonored the God who had given them the law. Verse 24 here follows with this terrible, honest charge that Paul gives them. The name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles, and it's blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. Because of the Jews that had the law. Because of the ones that the way that they were acting. The Gentiles knew the Jews were committing the sins. And they reacted as we would expect them to react. If these are God's people, then we don't think very much of their God. It's the warning and the charge that Paul gave these righteous Jews. And it's the exact same charge for us as Christians. We as Christians claim the faith. We claim to be covered by the blood of Christ. That the sins that we committed are covered because of Christ went to Calvary and he was beaten for us and he hung on the cross for us and he rose from the dead the third day. And that's how he conquered death and he conquered sin. And that is exactly right. That is 100% true. But we as Christians can't claim the blood of Christ and then act like the world. Because just like the Jews who were blaspheming the name of God, the Gentiles were watching them live the way that they were and saying, we don't want a part of your God. Look at the way that you act. The world will take the same idea to self-righteous Christians who claim Christ and live like the world. Why would they want to be a part of what we have going on when we're supposed to be different, but we look just like the world? So the same condemnation that Paul is giving the Jews, he can probably give to a whole bunch of Christians sitting in church today. You're blaspheming the name of God because of the way that you're living your life. It looks nothing like what Christ came and wanted us to do. That's the first Jewish guilt before God here, was possessing the law that did not bring righteousness. Go ahead and go to the next one for me. This is the second big thing the Jews were kind of hanging over the heads of the Gentiles, was the practicing of circumcision. Now, up to this point, this was kind of separated the Jews. This was the part of the law that was given unto them, and they still continued to think that because they were practicing this circumcision, that was bringing righteousness. Now, you've got Paul, who is a Jew, who has very much been a very high-ranking Jew, who would have probably taught this same principle to a whole bunch of people. Now, he is saying that this is not the case. He is changing. What he has been teaching now for so many years, he is now changing and telling the same people that he probably talked to about the importance of the law, is now explaining to them that it is different. So you can see why this is such a big deal for Paul to be doing this. Verses 25 through 27. Go ahead and get the next one for me. Sin nullifies outward circumcision. Now I'm going to explain that to you here in just a second. Let's look at verses 25 through 27. For circumcision, this is Paul, he's still going on this big speech, right? He's still talking to these people, still explaining to them how they're wrong. For circumcision verily profiteth, if thou keep the law, but if thou be a breaker of the law, thy circumcision is made uncircumcision. Right? Therefore, if the uncircumcision keep the righteousness of the law, shall not his uncircumcision be counted for circumcision? If shall not uncircumcision, which is by nature, if it fulfill the law, judge thee, who by the letter in circumcision does transgress the law? Now, there's some confusing language there in those couple of verses. This is what Paul is saying, right? He's going back to the reality of his charges against the Jews. Right now, no doubt here the Jews believed that even if they didn't keep all of the law, they could fall back on this covenant of circumcision. That would make them clean. That would make them righteous before God. They had performed this ritual as a rite, just as God had instructed over in Genesis chapter 17. You can see God instructing them to do this. Also in Leviticus chapter 12, we see the law of this procedure. All right. Now, because of this procedure, the Jews felt guaranteed that they were in good standing with God. Regardless of how they lived their life, they thought that this procedure, this keeping of this law, allowed them to be good before God. So you see the importance that they had on this ritual. Right? That this was their calling card. Right? This was the thing that made sure things were good. Okay? Then you got Paul coming in and saying, yeah, I don't think so. There's some other stuff here that you don't completely understand. So they had a value in circumcision. If it was accompanied by keeping points of the law, but if a Jew disobeyed the law or scorned the law at any point, it was thought that this would still these things would still be okay. Now, Paul comes in and we got verses 25, 26, and 27. All right, and he is saying that at any point that the Jew doesn't keep the law, that his circumcision now becomes uncircumcision. That it doesn't matter anymore. That it doesn't mean anything. Right? Paul's point is that every Jewish sin and that circumcision is not the solution to their sins. So he's explaining that every one of them sins, but circumcision is not the solution. To further his point, Paul teaches here that if an uncircumcised person kept the righteous requirements of the law perfectly, God would then accept his uncircumcision as circumcision. His righteous heart would be righteous, not whether or not he had been circumcised or not. That would make him acceptable before God, would be the righteousness of his heart. He goes on to write that the uncircumcised man who keeps the law would rightly judge the disobedient circumcised Jew. Paul is saying that a person who is righteous in God's eyes even though he may be uncircumcised, would still be acceptable to God, while the disobedient circumcised Jew would not be accepted unto God. Now you've got Paul telling this to the leaders of the Jewish faith. Right, this would have been the same thing of somebody coming in here and telling us that God doesn't exist. This is how blowing minds that Paul's doing. Right, he's telling them that an uncircumcised person who is righteous before God, God would accept over a circumcised Jew who had been disobedient. Sin nullified outward circumcision. Sin nullifies outward circumcision. It is a worthless sign if a Jew did not put his faith in God for salvation. The only way to nullify sin, the only way to nullify unrighteousness, the only way to cover your sin is by the blood of Christ. Nothing that you can legally do, nothing that you can, no law that you can keep by yourself, not enough work that you can do in your life, not enough good things you can do for the people, not enough charities you can donate to. Nothing works for covering sin except for the blood of Christ. That's what Paul is telling these people. That's what he's telling us. The exact same thing for us as readers today of the book of Romans. Now, we're not Jewish. We don't follow these same laws. We're Gentiles, right? We don't have the Jewish bloodline in us. Maybe partly Jewish. We're not fully Jewish like these people were. And just same